Welcome back. This is the start to the module on controls and control frameworks. And this lesson is all about what a security control is. Before we get into it, I want to say that the term security control may be unfamiliar to you, but one way to think of it is a mechanism that keeps us from going off the rails. It keeps us secure and in check. Our learning objectives for this lesson are to define the term security control and identify the different types of controls, which are physical, logical or technical, and administrative. So what is a security control? At its most basic level, a control is something that affects an outcome, like a volume control or a thermostat. You turn it up and down, you have an effect. A security control is something that we use to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of a system and reduce risk to an acceptable level. We'll talk more about risk management later, but you'll want to be aware of the idea that there's always risk out there and you can't ignore it. But you can take steps to control it and reduce it. Businesses have to decide how much risk is going to be acceptable for them, and once they apply controls, the risk that is remaining is called residual risk. When we apply a control, it usually comes with a cost, and leadership has to evaluate the cost versus the impact. Controls can be detective, corrective, or preventive. And we'll talk a bit later about control frameworks and how they help us follow best practices in applying controls. Types of controls include physical, logical or technical, and administrative. Physical are probably easiest to recognize: locks, barriers, that type of thing. Logical and technical, by this we mean passwords and firewalls and things that are built into the system to prevent someone bad from getting in at its most basic level. And administrative are directives, regulations, and even training that we use to make sure that we're keeping things safe and secure. So a little bit more about physical controls. These are probably the easiest to think about. And, as I said, we're talking about physical barriers, fences and gates, guards, guard dogs, but also things like CCTV, and alarm systems, and maybe some features that you haven't noticed, like crime prevention through environmental design, where landscaping around a building will have boulders to prevent vehicles from driving up to the building, as well as wide open spaces to be able to spot intruders, and plantings that have sticker bushes to both deter someone from walking by or pick up evidence if they do brush past. There are many advances in this area. One example is acoustic sensors that detect the breaking of glass and alert the security team about it. For cybersecurity, physical controls are important because bad actors can use social engineering to attempt to get into your building and walk around and learn about your systems without being detected. Physical controls make that harder for them to do. Logical or technical controls are, again, these things that are built into the computer systems to prevent unauthorized access. Things like passwords and password policy enforcement. And by this, I mean the system telling you, hey, your password isn't strong enough. Firewalls, endpoint security, vulnerability scanning, encryption, all of these types of things. Now, one thing to keep in mind about logical or technical controls is that they can affect performance by slowing things down. Obviously, you can't just sit down and start working. You have to log in. You have to go through possibly multi-factor authentication, that type of thing. But it's considered important enough to slow things down. And these types of controls should be assessed at least annually to make sure we're keeping up with the threats that are out there and keeping things as secure as possible. We also want to make sure that they're continuing to work as they're supposed to. Administrative controls are all about directing and controlling behavior. These types of controls include policies, and policies are the what and why that we need to do what we need to do. And they're usually decided at the executive level of an organization. So think about the C-level deciding what and why we need to do things. Procedures, on the other hand, are going to be decided at the business unit level. And that is where we're talking about how we're going to do things. Guidelines are recommendations that we need to follow, and standards are things that we must do. Another thing to think about here is how some administrative controls sort of support things like the physical controls. So if you have a policy that you must wear a badge with your picture on it, it helps support the physical controls that say, only authorized people can be in the building. If you see someone who doesn't have a badge or has a badge with someone else's picture on it, you're going to be suspicious and think, hey, maybe this person shouldn't be in the building. Similarly, a password policy and a clean desk policy can support the same type of thing. With the clean desk policy, if a stranger gets into the building, they can't learn as much if they walk around and everyone's desk is cleared off and things are locked away. So these things all kind of work together to support the overall security of your organization. So to summarize, in this lesson, we talked about what a security control is, and we went over the main types of security controls: physical, logical or technical, and administrative. You can think of a control as something that affects an outcome, and a security control as something that keeps us safe and on the rails. That does it for this part. I'll see you in the next lesson.
Okay. Okay, shells. Okay. Okay.
We had a single design, we had to make the site look exactly like that design, and then we were done. Now there's some problems with that. Browsers used to render things differently, but at the end of the day, we just had this one layout to do. It was completely static. We just had to recreate what probably a Photoshop document that we were given looked like, and that was it. Now we have to take a design and we have to make it work on every device, from sometimes a watch screen up to an 80-inch television. That's not necessarily something that's super easy to do. But we have the fundamentals down. We understand how to make a static site, so it's time to get into the responsive frame of mind, and we're going to work our way up from getting a design to simply work on a single screen size to being able to get it to work on any device. Thinking responsively isn't easy at first, but we are going to work our way up. We're going to be exploring the do's and don'ts, and we're going to look at how we can plan things out to make our life a little bit easier in the long run. But do know this is just an introduction to thinking responsively. We're not covering everything there is in this module about how to build a responsive website. We're getting our feet wet with it. We're going to start looking at a few new things, but I don't want to overwhelm. As I've said before, I like teaching through projects. We get a project, we're going to learn the different things we need to get that project to work, and then as we get into more complex projects, we can add on more complexity to the CSS. So we're always adding on new things, but we're not just dumping it all on at first. And this module is really going to set the stage for everything that's going to come. We're going to look at how to approach a layout. So you see a layout, like when you see that layout, what do you do? How do you start planning? How are you supposed to start moving forward? Before we jump into the layouts, though, we're going to look at CSS units, because we've seen pixels so far, but we have a whole bunch of different ones. We have ones that are absolute, we have relatives, and percentage are sort of relative units as well. And we're going to be looking at all of those. We're going to be looking at the basics of Flexbox. Now, if you did the CSS crash course, you touched on Flexbox right at the end of it, but we didn't really get into it. We just thought, whoa, it makes columns, and that was it. So this one's not going to be a deep dive. I have a full module later on in the course. We're going to do a deep dive into Flexbox to really make sure we understand the ins and outs of it, because Flexbox is complex. And again, I don't want to throw all this complexity at you and overwhelm you. Here's how we can start using Flexbox to just make things start working. And once you are comfortable being able to do that, later on, we've had a lot of practice with it. We can up the complexity on it a little bit. And also the basics of media queries. So media queries are an essential tool in adapting our site to different screen sizes. We're going to be seeing in this just how they can work and how we can start using them to make our websites work across different sizes. We are going to work on a few different things, but this is the main thing we're going to be focusing on, which is a 3-page website we're going to be doing, and we're going to be making it fully responsive. We're going to look at how we can go from the mobile view of that up to this full screen site just like this one. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to it. So let's jump into the lessons and start learning how we can start thinking responsively. Before we can really take a dive into making responsive websites, the first thing that we need to do is take a bit of a deeper dive into CSS units. There are many different types of units that we can use. We have absolute units, and this is what we've already been using. We have relative units, and we also have percentage, which is a bit of a special case. So absolute units, you've already seen these. This is the pixel. They're the easiest ones to understand because they're a fixed size and they're always the same size. We also have a whole bunch of other ones that you don't see come up too often. You have points, centimeters, millimeters, inches. If you can think of a unit that exists in the real world, you can use that unit in your designs. Now, the thing that's weird about those, ignoring pixels, we're just thinking of like the point, centimeter, millimeter, inch. If you put your like a ruler up on the screen, they're not really going to correspond to it. You shouldn't really be using them unless you're doing print styles. You can make a style sheet or a set of styles for a document to be printed. In that case, that's fine. But the rest of the time, if you need an absolute fixed unit, go with your pixel. We also have percentages. So percentages are mainly used for widths, and they're pretty easy to understand because it's a percentage that's relative to the parent. Now, I said they're usually used for widths because on height, things get a little weird. Sometimes it's relative to the height of the parent, sometimes it's actually relative to the width of the parent, but we're not setting heights very often. We're going to see some use cases later on in this course where we will be setting heights, but for now, we're going to be sticking with percentages for widths because that's usually where we're going to be using them. And it makes it really easy both to do something that's going to be like 80% of the whole browser window, or if it's children, sometimes you want 2 columns, so one of them is 60% and one of them is 40%, or 70% and 30%, and you know they're taking up the 100% total. So it's much easier than trying to calculate the actual pixel dimensions on things when you use percentages. The last type is relative units, and there are 2 different types of relative units. There's units that are relative to font sizes, and there's units that are relative to the viewport. So the viewport is your browser window. In this starting to think responsibly, we're not going to get into the viewport unit. We're going to focus on the ones that are relative to font size because they're used so much more. The viewport units have special cases. They are definitely used in some situations, and we are going to look at them in this course, just not in this module. Now, the idea of having units that are relative to font size, it might sound a little bit complicated, but once you start playing around with them, it's really not that bad. So as I said, we're only going to be paying attention to the ones that are relative to font size for now and not the viewport units. So the 2 units we're going to be seeing are M and Rem. There are actually other ones as well. You have a CH unit and some others, but we're not going to get into them for now. We're going to focus on the M and the Rem because these are the ones that are used the most often. The viewport units, just so you know them, we have the VW, VH, VMin, VMax. They stand for the viewport width and height, and then the viewport minimum or maximum, which those ones are weird and they have specific use cases, but the VW and VH are pretty handy. As I said, we're not going to get to them in this module though. So that's it for our quick introduction into the different units. In the next one, we're going to get our hands dirty with a little bit of code. And since we've already been using pixels, which is an absolute unit a lot, we're going to take a dive in the next video and look at how percentages work and get our hands dirty with a layout. So we're going to start with percentages instead of M and Rem just because it's much easier to understand how they work. So if we look at a layout like this, and we will be making this layout in the next module of the course once we've learned how to think responsibly, because we're going to make it responsive. We're going to make this work on small screens up to big screens, and that's going to be our project in the next one. But for now, just looking at this and thinking about it with what we know at the moment, I would have a set width on the total size of this. So say I say the entire document here is 960 pixels. So I set a width, I put a container on the whole thing or something, and I say width 960 pixels. So that's fine, and this is a common size we used to use in the really, really old days. And then I have the 2 parts here, so I need to define an individual width for the left and the right side. So I might say, well, I want that left side to be about 70% of that, so I need to calculate what that is. So I do 960 times 0.7, and that would give me 672 pixels. So now I know the width, and I'd set the width of 672 pixels for my left side. But then there's also the other side, and I have to find out the fixed pixel value for that side. And then I also have padding in there, so then I'd have to start subtracting padding and doing all this. Oh, it's annoying, right? You don't want to have to start thinking about all of these things. And this is for a fixed width.
Ah,
Imagine
ja,
now
doğru,
you're trying to
evet.
bring all those numbers into it for, you're trying to like adjust it for different screen sizes. So instead of complicating matters, when we think responsively, we want to simplify matters. A big part of thinking responsively, and sorry if I ever say responsibly, they're so similar. So when we start to think responsively, it's all about trying to simplify and not complicate matters. So you remember this layout, we just finished it, but let's say we wanted to turn this into a more responsive layout instead of the fixed layout like we have now. We can do that. So let's go and take a look at how we can do it. And you can probably guess the one thing that we really need to change is this fixed container width, because right now it has a width of 620 pixels. So we have a set width on that container. I'm also going to turn this border back on just so we can really visualize what's happening while we're playing with this. I'm going to save that for the moment. We're going to come and take a look at it. And you can see when I play with the screen size, we're set at 620 pixels. So it's working at big screens. But if we go smaller, all of a sudden I run into this problem where I have side scrolling. So I get a scroll bar to go left and right, because my screen is too small for the content that's in there. My content is wider than my viewport width, and that causes the side scrolling issue. So if I was going to open this page on a cell phone, it just wouldn't work, right? I would get this issue. I wouldn't be able to see it. I get this weird problem there that I'm not even going to worry about right now. It just does not look good. So how can we fix it? As I mentioned, we want to change this from a set width to a percentage. So what I want you to do right now is change this over to a percentage. It has to be 100% or less, and I would go with less than 100%. It would defeat the purpose of the container if not. Try different sizes, see what they look like, play around with the screen size in the player here, and then once you're happy and you sort of see what's going on, I'm going to dive in and we'll look into it in a little bit more detail. Great, so it's pretty evident. Let's say I do 50% on this. I think it's obvious what's going to happen is those containers are now 50% of the total screen size. You might have got a little surprise with your image sticking off the side, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But we can see with the container now, as I grow or shrink my screen, the container is adjusting itself automatically, which is pretty cool, I think. Because we know the container's width is set to 50%, I know I have 25% on the left there and 25% on the right left over. So that's pretty cool that I can sort of make this container that adapts to my screen size. Now the problem is my image. So before we see how we can actually fix that thing that's going on with the image and understanding that, what I really want you to understand is what is this 50% of? So if my container is 50%, it's always going to be 50% of its parent. So we have a few different containers here, as we can see. This container here is 50% of section 1. This one is 50% of my header, and this one is 50% of section 2. Now, my header, my section 1, and my section 2 don't have widths on them. And block level elements, by default, have a width of 100%. So section 1, section 2, and my header are all 100% of my screen size. So that just means that my container ends up being 50% of my screen size. Now, what would happen if I came and set a width of 500 pixels on my header? Can you take a guess before you come and look at what's actually happening on the page? What do you think has happened to the container that was inside my header? So let's go and take a look at it, and you can see that I've limited my header to 500 pixels, and this container is 50% of that 500. So I get 25% there, 50% here, and then another 25% there. So this container is now smaller than this container on this side, because each one is only looking at its parent and it's not looking at anything else. Now, normally I'm not going to have a set width on something because that makes that whole thing look pretty ugly. So we're going to get rid of that and go back and take a look at it. And there we go, we fixed that. So just remember always when you're using a percentage, that percentage is always relative to its parent. But a lot of the time, the parent is just defaulting to 100%. We're going to run into situations where maybe that's a little bit different. Even if you feel a little bit confused right now, in the long run, it does actually make our lives much, much, much easier. I'm going to leave this video for here so you can play around with it a little bit. Make sure you really understand how that's working. If you're a little bit unclear, try playing with the width of your header, of your section 1 and your section 2 to really see how this affects it, and then maybe even play around with this width as a percentage just to really make sure it's clear. And then once you figured that out, in the next video, we're going to look at how we can fix that problem that's going on with the image. Okay, so we have our containers that are set at 50% of our total screen size, but we have this really awkward problem that's going on with our image. Our image just does not look very good when it's sticking out the side like that, so how can we fix it? Can you think of a way that we could solve that problem? Is there something that we've looked at so far that would solve it? Because we have all the tools we need to be able to fix that. So see if you can think about it, come into code, try playing around with something, and see if you can solve the width of the image. So hopefully what you thought of is you can actually set a width on your image. So if we come and take a look here, images are a little bit weird. And what you probably don't remember is when we first were looking at block and inline, I mentioned that images are actually an inline element. They can flow with text. If I put an image in a paragraph, the text on that line will actually flow with it, put that image in the paragraph itself. They're a bit of a special case. There's things that are a little bit different with them, but they are technically an inline element. So they're not defaulting to 100% width, they're defaulting to the size of themselves, what that size of the image is. So what we can actually do is we can come in, and I like grouping it sort of here with all the other things that I'm doing in the general area instead of the more specific areas where I'm styling things. And I can select my images, so IMG. I'm not putting a dot, I'm not putting anything else because I'm selecting my image itself. So I'm going to select my image. I'm going to give this a width. Now this width for now, I'm going to give this a width of 250 pixels. It's a set unit. We're not going to leave it there, but just to show you what that does. So look at that. My image size has shrunk down. The one thing you have to be really careful with if you set a width on an image is not to also set a height to it. Because if I set a height on this image, which you can do, it will actually end up stretching the image and distorting it and making it look really, really ugly. Whereas if you only put one or the other, so I could say a height or I could say a width, either one is going to work. And if I only have one of them, it's automatically going to handle the second property. So it's going to keep it in proportion instead of stretching it. So you know now that we can set a width on an image, how do you think we can get that image to match the size of the container? So hopefully you said you use a percentage, and what I want you to do is set it and see if you picked the right percentage. Try and set an actual size on this using percentage and see if it's fitting the way you think it would. All right, so there's two answers people usually think of. One of them is to give it a width of 100%, and the other one is a width of 50%. And the reason a lot of people think of 50% is because on my container, we gave that a width of 50% here. So if this has a width of 50%, it makes sense to give the image a width of 50%. But if you did that, you might have noticed it didn't work. It's pretty small. But if you shrink this, you'll see it is growing and shrinking with my page. So the percentage is working, just not what we thought it was. So we just have to remember what I said before about how percentages work. A percentage is always based on the width of the parent. So if we come and we look in our index here, when we set the width of the container, this was 50% of the width of section 1, which automatically was the full size of my screen. So it ends up being 50% of my screen width. This image, on the other hand, its parent is the container itself. So this image is whatever percentage I set for a width on my image will be a percentage of this container width. So if we come into my styles now, my image, I actually want it to be 100%. So if we go and look again, we can see that it has been fixed. And now, whatever I do here, my image is going to grow and shrink with the size of that container and match everything that's around it, which just makes the layout work much better. So if I come down and get rid of that magenta border and we go and look at it again, we can see that it looks nice and fancy and it fits well with the overall look of the document. The only thing is a 50% width is a little bit small. So if I come down to this, everything is getting a little bit smushed. I'd rather that it's sticking closer to the sides and I'm not getting like this massive, it's almost acting like padding. Look how small that image is. I can barely see it. So it's really common to not have a width of 50%, but to do like a 90% or something like that. Because on small screens, that's going to look a lot better. That's sort of that cell phone type look that you're probably used to having and seeing. But as this gets bigger, we do at one point, now we're getting too big. Lines of text going from one side all the way to the other is really, really awkward. So we want to try and avoid having text that stretches from one side to the other, like what's happening right now. And in the next video, we're going to look at how we can do that. We've got our layout working, it's looking nice and dandy, but it's getting too big now when we're getting up to these big sizes. We don't want that to happen. What we can do to do that is a new property. It works with the width, and you probably saw the name of this lesson was min and max width. So we can actually set a width and a maximum or minimum width on an element as well. So I'm going to come and put that border back on here of 2 pixels solid magenta, just so we can really see what's happening once again. And let's come and give this we have a width of 90%, but I'm also going to give it a max width of 600 pixels. All right, let's do 620 because that was our original design. So we'll keep it to 620 that we originally had. So now if we come and take a look at this and I refresh, you're going to see it's working at our small screen sizes. Our container is growing, it's staying at 90%. But at one point, it's going to get locked into play, and right around here, it stops growing because it's hit its maximum width. And that means at large screen sizes, my text and line lengths aren't going to get too long, but at small screens, everything works nice and perfectly. So we've sort of got the best of both worlds going now. We can set a set value for the maximum size we want, or we can keep a percentage to let it shrink when we want it to. We can also set a min width. So if I came on here and said min width, I'm going to set it pretty big, of 500 pixels. I wouldn't normally do this on a container, but just for demonstration purposes, we have our max, so it's never going to grow bigger than 620. And if I go this way, it will never get smaller than 500. So when I hit 500 pixels, you see it stops, and then I get side scrolling again, which is why I wouldn't set a min width on my container, but it does demonstrate how that property works. So for now, I'm going to take this off. I just wanted to introduce the idea of the minimum width in there, but for the max width, I will leave it on there. When we're starting to think responsively, for the container, this is a really, really common property to set on something to give a maximum size. That size really depends on the layout and what you're building, so I'm not going to say that there's a specific max size that you should be going. You will base it on the design that you're doing. I will be going more into some best practices for total lengths and total sizes in a little bit. Interestingly enough, if you put your max width above your width,
დომეინი ქონდათ ადრე, ნახე? და ალბათ პროსტა ახალს აკეთებენ. ნახე? ეს ქონდათ ალბათ ადრე და ახლა ახალს აკეთებენ. არე? როგორ ნახარ ვიცი? ფაინანსზე შევიდა პარტნიორებს აწერია. ჯერჯერობით ვერ ხედავ, მოიცა. ვერ ხედავ. იქნება უშუალოდ იმაზე არის მორგებული. ნახოთ რა. ნახენინა? ხაზავი.
Still going to work because they're two different values. Max width and width are two different ones. Same with min width. You can put them in any order in your CSS and it won't have an effect. It's going to work no matter what. So play around with them, see if you can get used to it or figure it out. If it's something that you're finding a little bit confusing, don't stress about it too much. We're going to be using these a lot in the following projects that we're going to be building. It's just going to help reinforce it the more we use it. So you'll get the hang of it in no time.
აბა რა არის ვერ მივხვდი გინდა მაგარი საიტი განახო და რა
მაგარი საიტი მაგათი საიტი თქო
მეკონა
ეს ვინ არის
ერთი წუთი
So we're moving on to the M unit, but if you're
Κάτι
wanting to
γάμα
get more
κόρος
practice
κόφιλα.
with percentages, don't worry, we're
Exita.
going to get a lot. We're going to be using them throughout this course. But there's two others that we really need to look into. So a quick recap on what relative units are. They call them relative units because they're relative to something else. They're either relative to
Άρα,
the
για
font
να σε
size or
γραβεύει.
to the size of the viewport.
Άρα,
So the
μεν
M
άρα.
and the RAM are both
Αν
relative to the font size of other elements. So M's are always relative to their parents' font size.
Αν ρωτήσω
And the
γίνει
font
μachine
size is an
arts,
inherited
verseli arts.
property.
Render
So if you don't
saklı
declare it
getiriyoruz.
anywhere,
Sabit.
it's getting it from the size that you set on the body. And if you didn't set it, the body's actually inheriting it from the root, the HTML element, and that has the 16 set on it. Now that I say by default because people can override the font size in the browser in their settings, and so that can actually change what the default is on that property, but we're not going to worry about that at all right now. But let's go and take a look at how they work. So I've kept the site that we were already working on, but I've deleted some stuff and we're going to be playing around with this a little bit. So before we get into the unit itself, I want you to think way back and we're going to create a list. So do you remember how lists work? You can do either an ordered or unordered list. I really don't mind. See if you can remember how they are, but if you don't, that's okay. It's been a long time since we've seen a list, but do your best to try and remember before I go and put one in here. And just give it like 2, 3, 4 elements. Make sure there's not just one list item in there, but there should be multiple list items in there.
Aspen.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create my own list. I'm going to do an unordered list, so it's a UL, and I'm going to close that UL, and I'm going to come into here and just create a few list items. So open and close LI, and I'm going to put in a few here, and I'll fast forward while I put the content inside of these. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look quickly at what my list looks like there. So we have a bulleted list since I used an unordered list, and we can start styling things up a little bit. So let's come over to my CSS file here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my UL to have a font size of 1M. And when I do that, nothing's actually going to change because 1 means copy the font size of the parent. Now, the parent doesn't have a font size on it, so it's going to go down and down and down until it finds something that does have a font size on it. So the font size is being declared all the way up here on my body. So the font size is 18 pixels here. So that means if I change this 18 pixels to, say, 25 pixels, everything stays the same. So my paragraphs got bigger. This got bigger because as an inherited property, it's sort of the same as setting something as 1M. You're saying match 1M is saying match the font size of the parent. So it won't actually have an effect. Where it will have an effect is, and I'm going to bring my UL all the way to the top here just so I don't have to scroll up and down. If I change this font size to 1.5, that's the same as saying that this is, so 1.5M is equal to 150% of the font size of the parent. So we can go and look at how that would work. So if I refresh, now this is massive. It's now 150% the size of my paragraphs here, which are at the 25 pixel. So whatever I change on here, if I change this down to 10 pixels, this will now, so it'd be 1.5M is 150%. So that means in this case, it would be equal to 15 pixels. So you can do a quick math to figure out exactly. So you can see this is super, super tiny down here at the bottom, whereas this list, at least it's at a readable size. So it's always a relative unit. But as I said, it's always relative to its parent. So in this case, it's inside of section 1. So if I said section 1 has a font size of 20 pixels, this font size is now 30 pixels because it's going to be 1.5 times bigger than the font size of its parent. So it's always a font size that is relative to its parent. Now you might be wondering why we'd want to do that. But imagine on these, let's get rid of this for the moment. I'm going to comment it out because we're going to need that later. But let's say on my H1 here, instead of setting a font size of 36 pixels, I said this is 3M. And then I said this one here is 2M. And then I have my body, which is set to, say, 16 pixels for now. So if I come and take a look at that, everything is sized and it's all looking good. But if I come and change this number and I set this to 10 pixels, everything is going to adjust with that. So now all of those units have automatically adjusted in size. My headings are smaller, my list is smaller, my paragraphs are smaller, my headings have shrunk. Everything is reacting together instead of each being a completely separate unit. And this can be really, really handy where you can change one font size and have it affect your entire site. It's very handy, it's very useful. But there is a big problem with M's, and we're going to see what that is in the next video. Before we get there though, if you want to just play around in here, try different M sizes, see if you can get the hang of it, play around maybe with your H1 and H2 sizes, and then modifying this. Try playing with the parent font sizes if you want to, and just get a little bit of a handle of how it's working. Just like percentages though, these are units we're going to be using a lot from now on. I just want you to get a vague idea of how they're working before we dive in and start using them a lot. So even if it's a little bit weird right now, it will be something you get used to a lot faster than you might think. So as I mentioned at the end of the last video, there is a problem with the M unit. M's are super convenient for some things. We're going to see some use cases where I use them all the time. But when we use them for font size, it can create this weird cascading effect where things just get out of control, and it can be really, really bad. So if we come and look, I'm just continuing where we left off. Nothing is different from before. What I'm going to do is up here, I'm going to keep my font size.
სინქრონული არე? JavaScript. ჩვენი
ხარ გინდა რომ გაგიწე ხო შემთხვევით.
გაჩნი.
აი ტატუზე რა საწყდით ერთი ჩატში, ჰა? ვის რა პრობლემა გაქვს ერთი ჩემ ტატუსთან? გაქვთ.
და მე მეუბნები?
ხო, შენ ტყავი ერთადერთი კიდე. ერთადერთი. ერთ-ერთი.
აბა რა დავწერე მე ნახე.
არა აქვს მნიშვნელობა, ხო გიწევია.
დიდი მნიშვნელობა.
ავთოს პასუხი შენ გაიცი?
რაზე? რომ კონსოლ
ხო. მერე?
ანუ უყურე, იქ ეწერა რომ console log hello world-ი აწერიაო და მე დავაზუსტე რომ არა hello world-ის გარეშე თქო.
მაგარი ხარ.
ანუ რა hello world, ანუ სულ სხვა თემა არის console log-ი.
ხო.
ანუ რა შუაში იყო? ვერ გამოძერე?
ვერა.
Fuck.
ქვემოთვარი ლიდერბორდი. რა ჩამოეწერება მე სკროლითაც ბანძი იქნება მინიმუმ ერთი.
ეს რა ორმაგი რაღაც უთხრა.
10 pixels, so it's really, really tiny on my body. But what I'm going to do on section 1 is I'm going to give section 1 a font size to 2M. So the font size on my section 1 is twice as big as on the rest of it. But if we come and look at what's actually happened, is now this is an H2 and this is an H2. But this H2 is huge. And why is it so much bigger? And this is size 10. This is not 1.5 times bigger than that. This is not 15 pixels. But I have my list here is 1.5M. So why is it so gigantic? I mean, what's going on? And to make matters even worse, why not?
ნიკამით.
მოიცა რა, თავინოთ ვერ გავიგე. იმაზე რა ქენია? რა უნდა იქნება?
ნიკა იმაზე რა ქენი გუში.
აუ.
რატი ჟონები იმაზე რა ქენი მეთქი და მაინცო.
You know, we can make this even crazier. On my list items themselves, if I decided to set a font size of 1.5M, just for fun, you know, why not?
As soon as possible.
All of a sudden, they're massive. You know, it's getting out of control, literally getting out of control. And if you had other nested elements, it can get even worse and worse and worse. Because it's looking at the font size of the parent. So right now, my list item is looking at the font size of my list. and it's going to be 1.5 times bigger than my list. So it's doing this multiplication through all of these different elements until it finally, multiplies all,
იმას რა უნდა
going from
ბიჭო
10 times 2, so we're at 20 times
ლობიოდა
1.5, we're hitting 30,
ეგ არაფერი
and then we're going
ლობიოდა
times 1.5. So, it's getting massive. It's just getting
აუ
out of
ყველა
control
შენზე
big.
კი კაი რა.
That's also
ნინა,
why my
კაი
section
რა.
1 has a font size of 2M.
ჩემზე აბა
My
ვიზე წერს
H2 has a font size of 2M. So we're getting that cascading effect even here, which is why if we look here, my H2 at the top here is a lot bigger than my H2 that's down here, even though they're